Yes, it's Round the Table, your favourite slow TV radio podcast from the meeting point for students of English, not only in Bilbao but throughout the world. And coming up in this programme, we have some interesting phrases from recent conversations. We have a few phrasal verbs for you. We'll also be looking at a typical mistake. We have a few what's the difference questions, and of course we have our celebrity guest speaker with a very informative monologue on the topic of happiness. So first, let's look at some of these phrases. Going through a bad patch. Or it could be going through a rough patch. This patch here is referring to a period of time, a period in your life. So something bad is happening in your life. You might say, I'm going through a rough patch or a bad patch. There are many other uses for the word patch, and it is a very interesting word. I'll tell you about it sometime. Take the shine off something. Last week we looked at every cloud has a silver lining, and I was telling you that when something bad happens, sometimes you can find something positive within all that negativity. This is kind of the opposite. We use it to refer to something good happening, but it's not really quite as good as you'd like it to be. So imagine you were in a sporting event and you had a great victory and you won a trophy, but your parents were not able to come to see you win the trophy. So you're very happy that you won the competition, but the fact that your parents couldn't come to see you do it sort of takes the shine off. So it's not as good as it could have been, but it's still good. The next one, like a bear with a sore head. This is probably describing how you feel first thing in the morning before you've had that cup of coffee. When you wake up maybe with a hangover. And yes, like a bear with a sore head. You're very grumpy, you're in a very bad mood, and you don't like people talking to you first thing in the morning. Gone to the dogs. This expression is probably describing how society is not as good as it used to be. People say, oh, the country's gone to the dogs, meaning it used to be much better. It's a very negative expression, really, probably used by an old man complaining about change. Over the moon means really happy. When something happens to you, you can be over the moon. You become a parent, or you pass an exam and you say, I was over the moon. Down in the dumps is quite the opposite. When you're very depressed, we say, I'm feeling a bit down in the dumps. Under the weather is kind of similar, but under the weather is a little bit ill as well. You don't have the energy that you normally do because you're a bit ill. So we like to blame it on the weather and say, I'm a bit under the weather at the moment. As happy as Larry describes someone who's very happy, usually describing their personality, is happy as Larry, and nobody knows who this Larry is in this expression. Ten a penny means very common. You see them everywhere. They are 10 a penny. I presume it used to mean very cheap because you could get 10 of them for 1 penny, but now it seems to refer to the fact that they're very common. And finally, in this section, it's not my forte. Yes, I know what you're going to say. Forte, that looks like a French word. It could be Italian. But it means it's not my strength. So if you're learning English, for example, you might be very good at grammar and remembering lots of vocabulary, but maybe pronunciation, not so good. You would say, pronunciation is not my forte. And now we have a few phrasal verbs. Wear off came up in conversation this week. This means to lose effect, especially when you're talking about drugs or something like that, alcohol maybe. So if you went to the dentist, you might have an anaesthetic. When you're having a filling, they might inject you with an anaesthetic. And then for some time after leaving the dentist, your face is still a bit numb. And maybe it takes another hour or more for the effect to wear off. So it's that declining effect. I thought I'd add that one because last week we looked at wear in and wear out. So I suddenly realised there's wear off as well. Cheer up is another one to do with happiness. When someone's looking a bit sad, you say cheer up. Or you might buy somebody a present to cheer them up. So you can see the use of up here as a modifier for the word cheer, and it's an increasing type of modification, the same as perk up. To perk somebody up is to make them more lively, not just happy, but a bit more lively as well. Sometimes you might have coffee in the morning to perk yourself up. And those of you that watch Friends, that TV series, you might realise that the cafe that they go to is called Central Perk. It's not called Central Park. It's a play on words. If you look at the window behind them, it says Central Perk, and that's because they go there to drink their coffee, you see. So to perk up is to become a bit more lively. Bring down is when somebody or something makes you depressed. If somebody's being very miserable, you might say, "Oh, don't bring me down with your negativity." And not to be confused with let down, which is to disappoint. So you might say, "I'm going to have to let you down and not come to your party at the weekend." Or when something doesn't happen, you might say it was a big letdown. So that can change to a noun as well. So let down, which brings us on to what's the difference? The first what's the difference is deception and disappointment. The letdown I've just mentioned would be the disappointment. Deception in English is something quite different. Deception is when someone is lying to you to make you believe something else which is not true. That is a deception. And I was looking into this false friend. Why is our word deception so similar to the Spanish word that means disappointment? Well, really, it's if you take them both back to their origins, it's when one thing is not what you thought it was going to be. And in Spanish, it's become the feeling of when something is not what you expected, which is normally a sad feeling. That's why it means disappointment in Spanish. But in English, it became something not being what you expected it to be, where somebody's deliberately claimed something false. So you can see how these false friends have separated over history and become two different things. Then I was looking at our word disappointment, and I thought this is very strange, because if you take off the negative prefix, you've got the word appointment, and appointment is when you have to go to the doctors or the dentist and they give you a time and a date to be there. That's your appointment. And I thought, how can putting a negative prefix on appointment become disappointment? It seems unconnected. A similar thing is happening. It actually comes from the verb to appoint, to say something will happen at a certain time. And then when that thing doesn't happen at a certain time, that's where disappoint comes from, when something doesn't happen. And then we took on the feeling of sadness when something doesn't happen as expected. And then we add the suffix ment. So disappointment comes from disappoint. It doesn't come from appointment. That's why it's a confusing looking word. And don't forget there's only one S in disappointment because the prefix is dis. Not like in dissatisfaction where there is two S's, dissatisfaction, because you've got a dis prefix on satisfaction. The next one is diversion and entertainment. We don't use diversion as in entertainment anymore. If you read something from about 100 years ago, you might find that something is described as being very diverting or something like that. Normally now, diversion is when the traffic has to go via a different route because they're working on a road or something like that. They close a road and you have to go a different way. That is a diversion. We don't often see it in the modern world as entertainment, though if you read old books you might see it in that way. So entertainment is something that you enjoy doing. The last one in this little section is family and familiar. We don't use familiar in the same way as you might think. Familiar is something that we know, something that we've experienced many times in the past. Usually we use the word family in compound nouns. So if you go for a dinner with your family, you say it's a family dinner. It's a family dinner. So a familiar meal would be something you've eaten many times before, and a family meal is a meal you enjoy with your family. Here is a very typical mistake. Your use of actually, or actually, if I say it quickly, actually. It's one of those where the y joins together. Actually, actually. It's not what you think it is. I would use actually to show surprise or to contradict previous information. So, for example, if you say to me, "Are you an American?" I would say, "Actually, I'm British." So I'm correcting your previously held belief. I can also use it to show surprise. So if you normally arrive late, I would say, "Oh, you've actually arrived on time." But I don't use it in the sense of nowadays, or presently, or these days, or in modern times, or many other phrases like that which do not mean actualmente, as you might think. But we need to address the use of nowadays. Nowadays is an adverb. It's not an adjective. So I would usually use it at the beginning of a sentence, followed by a comma to separate it from the rest of the sentence. Nowadays, everybody has a mobile phone. I could use it at the end of the sentence and say, "There is a lot more traffic nowadays." But I cannot use it as an adjective, so I cannot say the nowadays technology or the nowadays children are very badly behaved. I would have to say the children of today. I could change that sentence of the nowadays children are very badly behaved and say nowadays, comma, children are very badly behaved. You see, that is an adverb relating to the whole sentence. It's not an adjective describing children. Okay, and that is a very typical mistake. And now I think it's time for a very interesting monologue from our friend across the pond. Celebrity guest speaker.
The pursuit of happiness is something that connects all human beings. Many people believe that happiness is something we all deserve to experience during our lives. Yet, finding true happiness is often more complicated than we expect. Some people search for it through success, money, relationships, or travel, while others discover that happiness can be found in much simpler things. A conversation with a friend, a walk in nature, music, or spending time with family can often bring more satisfaction than expensive possessions. At the same time, we constantly try to avoid the things that make us unhappy. Bad news, angry neighbors, stressful situations, and negative relationships can all affect our emotional well-being. However, life is impossible without sadness or disappointment. In fact, many psychologists argue that we need difficult moments in order to appreciate the good ones. Perhaps this explains why people often enjoy sad songs, emotional films, or tragic stories. These experiences remind us that suffering is part of life. Interestingly, poorer societies sometimes appear happier than wealthier ones. In many developing countries, people may own fewer possessions, yet they often have stronger communities, closer family ties, and a greater sense of belonging. Meanwhile, in richer countries, people can become trapped in a cycle of consumerism, always chasing the next purchase or achievement in the hope that it will finally make them happy. Nordic countries are frequently ranked among the happiest in the world. Although many outsiders imagine these places as cold or distant, their societies often provide strong healthcare systems, education, work-life balance, and social equality. Perhaps happiness is influenced not only by personal choices, but also by the structure of the society around us. This raises important questions about modern society itself. Are we encouraged to keep chasing happiness instead of simply enjoying life as it is? Advertising and social media constantly suggest that we are incomplete without something newer, better, or more exciting. As a result, many people spend their lives searching for satisfaction without ever fully reaching it. In today's political climate, negativity itself can become addictive, with people constantly encouraged to blame others for their problems. Political division, anger on social media, and the need to identify enemies can create a false sense of purpose while making societies more hostile and unhappy. In the end, life is short, and our time is limited. Maybe real happiness does not come from perfection or constant pleasure, but from learning to appreciate small, meaningful moments. A peaceful morning, laughter with friends, listening to music, or sharing a meal with loved ones can often bring more satisfaction than wealth or status. Happiness may remain difficult to define, but perhaps the secret lies in accepting that life will always contain both joy and sadness, while learning to value the simple pleasures that make the journey worthwhile.
And just to wrap up today's program, I've got a few more interesting bits of research on the question of happiness. Money is not everything. Obviously, you need enough money to cover the basics. You need a place to live and you need some food on your table. But apparently, once you've got that covered, more money doesn't make you happier, which sounds like a good thing. What is most important to the majority of people? A sense of community and your personal relationships. Another thing that came out in surveys is that people who regularly have family meals generally report a higher level of happiness than those that eat alone. It seems that the countries with the highest level of consumerism and the need to succeed often report higher levels of anxiety and stress, as you would imagine. Another interesting piece of research, they did a test with wallets. They got wallets, what you keep your money in. They put in some credit cards and some money, and in various cities they drop these wallets on the floor, and then they track them to see if they are handed in or how long it takes to hand them in. And they also question people about what they think will happen in the test. And apparently people in general are twice as honest as we imagine, which is quite a positive piece of news, I think. They've also done research into the effects of social media. Now, there is a correlation between anxiety and depression and heavy use of social media, but they don't say, they haven't discovered a causation. That's a very different thing. It might be that depressed, anxious people use social media more. It's not necessarily true that the social media causes the anxiety and depression. Now, here's another interesting thing. Here we have a chart showing the happiest countries in the world. And you will see that the Scandinavian countries report very high levels of happiness, which seems a bit strange, especially if you are from Spain, because here in Spain, all the Scandinavian countries seem to have a reputation for heavy levels of drinking and a lot of depression and a high suicide rate. But it's not actually true. I've looked into it. I've looked at statistics. If you go to the World Health Organization, you can find the statistics for drinking in various countries, and you actually find that those countries with the worst reputations actually have a lower consumption than here in Spain. Now, that might surprise quite a few people. I've also looked into the suicide statistics. It seems that Uruguay and Lesotho in South Africa have very high suicide rates, but nobody seems to know about this. But the Scandinavian countries seem to have a reputation for high suicide, which is not true. They're actually much the same as all the other countries in Europe. Which leads us on to another interesting discussion on national stereotypes and where they come from. And also the difficulty that we seem to have in unlearning something once we think we know something. Because I've already corrected this Nordic alcoholic myth many times in the past, and I'm sure I will again in the same conversation next year. But remember, popular wisdom is popular, but it's not wisdom. Anyway, that's all we have time for this week. I have no more for you. The next unit in the book is called Social-ish. Not socialist, not socialism, but social-ish. How much do we care about society and looking after others? I'm looking forward to some very interesting debates. So if I don't see you in class, have a good week. Till next week.